poor waitress served a stranger. But she didn't know he was a millionaire and was going to do this. Before continuing, make sure to subscribe to the channel so we can reach our goal of 1,000 subscribers. Enjoy the story. The scent of fresh coffee mingled with the soft clinking of cutlery and muffled laughter inside the small corner diner in Charleston, South Carolina. Behind the counter, wearing a worn-out apron and with her hair hastily tied back, stood 24-year-old Emily Parker, offering smiles more valuable than any tip. She didn't have much and maybe never really had, but inside her lived a quiet belief that one day, something would change. It wasn't ambition, it was hope. Emily had learned early on that life wasn't fair, but even so, it was still possible to be kind. That thought was what kept her going. Losing her mother at the age of 12 had left invisible yet deep scars. Since then, she had taken care of her younger sister, Sophie, as if she were the last good thing the world allowed her to protect. Their father, an alcoholic and perpetually absent, had vanished over time like smoke, and the rest was survival. Emily dropped out of school to work full-time, first cleaning houses, then waiting tables. But in all those places, she never lost her gentleness. Her strength lay in the tenderness with which she treated others, even when the world seemed too harsh for someone like her. The diner where she worked, called Rosie's, was simple, with walls adorned by vintage pictures and menus stained with coffee rings. The regulars called her Sweet Emily, and it was hard not to be charmed by her soft voice and the care she took in remembering everyone's name. Even exhausted, even with bills piling up and rent overdue, she made a point of asking how each person's day was going. And whenever there was a leftover dessert at the end of the night, she'd always bring it home to Sophie, who waited with eyes full of admiration and arms ready for a hug. Emily never dreamed big. Her idea of happiness was being able to pay the bills on time, keep Sophie safe, and maybe, just maybe, go back to school someday. She didn't believe in fairy tales, even though she loved them. She didn't expect a Prince Charming, though she secretly read about them in library books during her rare afternoons off. Maybe that's why she had shut herself off from love. Her life was so full of responsibility that there was no room left for flirting or illusions. She believed romance was something that happened to other people. People with more time or at least a heart less tired than hers. That night in particular, Emily was especially worn out. One of the waiters hadn't shown up, the crowd was larger than usual, and she had already burned her arm with hot coffee and dropped a glass of juice on the floor. Still, she kept going. She didn't know it yet, but something was about to change in the next few hours. A stranger would walk through that door, and with him, unknowingly, he'd bring the beginning of a new story. A story not even the most romantic books would dare to predict. The rain had started out light, almost shy, before turning into a dense curtain that blanketed the streets of Charleston. The droplets tapped against Rosie's awning, casting a melancholic tone over the fogged-up window where Emily was sorting through the last of the order slips. It was late, and customers had dwindled, as if the sky itself had called everyone home. That's when the door creaked open slowly, pushed by a tall figure wrapped in a dark overcoat, his damp hair falling messily over his forehead. Emily looked up instinctively, expecting just another ordinary face. But what she saw froze her in place for a brief moment. He was different. There was something about the man's presence that couldn't be explained by looks alone. His eyes were deep, constantly shifting, as if searching for something in the world or within himself. His unshaven face matched the slightly tired expression he wore, though it didn't come off as careless. He walked to the back of the diner, choosing the most secluded table, like someone who preferred not to be noticed. Emily approached with her order pad in hand and, without knowing why, felt her heart quicken just a little, as if the air had changed texture around him. "Good evening," she said softly, trying to ignore the wave of unexplained nerves rushing through her. "You can call me Emily. Can I start you off with a nice hot coffee?" He nodded, almost smiling, as if genuinely thankful for the simple gesture. "That would be great. 2 spoons of sugar, if you don't mind." His voice was deep, calm, but there was something unspoken between each word, a silence full of stories she didn't know, but somehow already wanted to hear. Emily jotted down the order but didn't step away right away. He looked at her with gentleness, and for a moment, their eyes met in a way that made her forget how to breathe. In the minutes that followed, Emily found herself watching the man from behind the counter, discreetly. He didn't touch his phone. He didn't glance at the clock. He just kept his eyes fixed on the steam rising from the cup, as if trying to find in the coffee a truth life hadn't yet revealed. It was rare to see someone so still in such a noisy world, and that fascinated her. He seemed out of place there, like a museum painting left hanging on a diner wall. But at the same time, there was something comforting about his presence that made her feel a little less alone. When he finished his drink and asked for the check, Emily walked over to his table with a smile, even though anxiety churned quietly inside her. He paid in cash, barely speaking. But as he stood up, he pulled something from his pocket, a small folded note, and left it beneath the coffee cup. She didn't notice it until she returned to clear the table. Opening the paper, a chill ran down her spine. Written in steady, confident handwriting were the words, "Thank you for the coffee. But more than that, thank you for reminding me what it feels like to be looked at with humanity." Emily stared at the now closed door, her eyes brimming with tears, not understanding how such a simple phrase could reach so deep. His name was still a mystery, but something inside her already knew. This man wasn't like the others. The next morning, Emily still felt the echo of that unfamiliar presence lingering in her chest. The note he'd left slept folded in her purse, a sweet little secret she reread in silence while her hands poured coffee or balanced trays. It was as if each word had pierced her, gently dismantling her defenses without asking for permission. Never before had a stranger made her feel so much with so little. But perhaps what struck her most was that he had seen something in her no one else seemed to notice: her humanity. When she opened the register at the end of her shift, her heart nearly jumped out of her chest. Inside the drawer, next to her order slip, was a neatly folded $100 bill. Emily blinked several times, as if the image might vanish at any second. It was a lot of money for someone who lived counting pennies. But more than the amount itself, it was the gesture that left her unsettled. He had left it quietly, without fanfare or show, like someone who simply wanted to say thank you, truly. Yes, it was a tip, but it was more than that. It was a deliberate act of silent recognition. Emily sat for a few minutes, holding the bill between her fingers, staring blankly into the distance. A wave of conflicting emotions washed over her. Gratitude, surprise, but also a kind of restlessness she couldn't name. Why would someone do that for a simple waitress? What had he seen in her? Would he come back? She forced herself to put the money away and head home, but the whole walk back, her mind circled around that calm gaze and that sentence that seemed written directly for her heart. That night, while Sophie slept in the room next door, Emily sat curled on the couch, hugging her knees, staring at the rain falling once again outside the window. The world looked the same, but something inside her had shifted. For the first time in a long time, she felt seen. Not for her looks, not for her kindness, but for her essence. It was as if that man had seen through the uniform, the dark circles under her eyes, the unpaid bills. He saw her, and that, for someone like Emily, was a rare gift, one too precious to ignore. In the days that followed, Emily went about her routine with the same familiar smile, but now there was something new behind her eyes, a flicker of anticipation. With each customer who walked through the door, her heart braced itself, only to quietly fall again when she realized it wasn't him. She didn't know his name, didn't know if he'd return, but something inside her, something beyond reason, whispered that this wasn't over. There was an invisible thread tying their stories together. And even without understanding why, Emily began to wait for him. as if she already knew that what had happened wasn't a goodbye, but the beginning of something much greater. It was a Saturday afternoon, and business at Rosie's was unusually brisk for that time of day. Charleston's humid heat made the window panes sweat, and the scent of freshly baked apple pie drifted into the street like an open invitation. Emily, her hair pulled into a loose bun, balanced two plates while chatting with an elderly couple from the neighborhood. She was distracted, giggling softly at an old story, when the door opened once more. The bell rang the same as always, but the silence that followed felt entirely different. She turned instinctively, and time stopped. It was him, the same dark overcoat, now slung over his arm. His hair drier, the stubble on his face more defined. But the eyes, the eyes were just the same. Intense, curious, almost serene. Emily felt a chill run up her spine. Her heart raced without asking permission, and her hands began to sweat ever so slightly. He saw her and smiled with a shy curl of his lips, like someone who had found something he'd been hoping for, unsure it would still be there. For a second, she didn't know whether to run to him or disappear behind the kitchen door. Nicholas, though she didn't know his name yet, sat at the same table as before, as if he wanted to recreate the exact setting of a meeting that had never quite happened. Emily, after taking a deep breath to steady herself, walked toward him with her notepad in hand, unable to stop the small smile that tugged at the corner of her lips. "Coffee with 2 spoons of sugar?" she asked, breaking the ice. He chuckled, surprised she remembered. "I thought you'd forgotten about me by now." "Some presences don't go unnoticed," she replied, unaware that her words carried more weight than she intended to reveal. This time, the silence between them wasn't awkward. It was comforting. He introduced himself as Nicholas Reed and said he'd been traveling over the past few days but couldn't get the taste of the coffee, or the note he'd left, out of his mind. Emily laughed, a little shy, and the two spoke as if they were old friends picking up a conversation that had paused years ago. What was supposed to be a quick stop turned into an entire afternoon. She told him about Sophie, about how she taught herself to cook, about her small but sincere dreams. He listened like someone collecting words, his eyes hanging on to every detail. When Nicholas said goodbye that afternoon, he didn't leave behind a note or an extravagant tip. He left something much simpler and infinitely more powerful. "Can I come back tomorrow?" he asked softly, almost as if asking for permission. Emily nodded with a slight tilt of her head, but inside, she felt as though her heart had just been awakened from a long sleep. Watching him leave, she had the unmistakable feeling that her life had just shifted, not through a grand, dramatic moment, but through the subtlest detail of all. Someone at last wanted to stay. The days that followed were different for Emily. She began waking up before her alarm, as if her heart already knew something special was waiting for her. Nicholas started coming in regularly, always at the same time, always choosing the same table in the back of the diner. There was no routine in what they shared. With every conversation, a new discovery emerged. About her, about him, about life itself, which somehow felt lighter when poured into honest words. Slowly, gestures began to carry more meaning than the words themselves. A smile that lingered a little longer. A light touch of hands as she handed him the check. A gaze that remained, even after their eyes looked away. Still, Emily began to wonder, why would someone like him come back, day after day, listening to her simple stories, captivated by her mundane tales and modest dreams? Nicholas wore modest clothes, but she noticed the details. The expensive watch, the graceful way he spoke, the refined vocabulary. He didn't seem to belong there. He looked like he came from another world. A world of plush carpets, glass hallways, and quiet rooms with views that touched the sky. And yet, there he was, choosing the smell of coffee and the clatter of dishes just to see her smile. As days went by, Emily opened up like never before. She spoke of the constant fear of letting Sophie down, of the exhaustion that sometimes made her cry silently in the shower, of the ache of missing her mother that never quite faded. Nicholas listened without interrupting, his eyes focused, his heart exposed. He never tried to fix her problems, never offered ready-made solutions. He simply stayed. And for Emily, that was more valuable than any gift. To be truly heard was rare. And Nicholas did it like he was listening with his whole body. One afternoon, during a brief break, he asked what she would do if she could completely change her life. Emily went quiet for a moment, not because she didn't have an answer, but because no one had ever asked her that before. I guess I'd just like to have time. Time to breathe, to write, to not be constantly chasing after some bill, you know? She said, her eyes misty, wearing a smile that tried to mask the pain. Nicholas didn't say anything, but in that moment, something inside him broke, or maybe it finally came together. There was so much truth in her words, so much dignity in such a simple wish, that he realized he had never met someone so real. As Emily returned to work, he kept watching her from a distance. The way she treated each customer, how carefully she cleared the plates, how she smiled even when her feet were surely aching. And he thought, a lump forming in his throat, how unfair the world could be. That woman, rich in empathy, generosity, and strength, had never had anything in excess. And yet, she had never stopped being kind. Nicholas knew she had no idea who he really was. And for that very reason, he wanted to stay right there, in that simplicity that made everything feel more genuine. Because maybe, just maybe, it was only in this place that he could be seen, not for his name or his wealth, but for who he truly was. It was a golden afternoon in Charleston, the sky brushed with soft pastels and the breeze whispering gently through the trees. Emily had finished her shift early, something that rarely happened. When she stepped out of the diner, she spotted Nicholas across the street, leaning casually against a lamppost, wearing a calm smile and eyes more alive than she'd ever seen. She furrowed her brows in surprise as he lifted a small bottle of iced tea like he was offering an invisible invitation. "I have an idea," he said, almost in a whisper. She hesitated for a second, then smiled subtly. And in that moment, something began to shift. Nicholas took her on a walk through the city she knew so well, but in a way she had never experienced before. They strolled through Battery Park, sat on a bench overlooking the Ashley River, watching the boats lazily drift by. He listened more than he spoke, just like always, but that day he began to open up too. He told her about his love for photography, about the books he read when the world felt too loud, about how he had always felt out of place, even while surrounded by everything. Emily listened intently, and the more he shared, the more she realized there was something behind the calm confidence he carried: loneliness. As they walked along the cobblestone streets, she deliberately brushed against a flower mural she'd adored since she was a child. Nicholas stopped beside her, watching how she touched the petals like someone reading an old memory. "You're made of details," he said, almost without thinking. Emily blushed, unsure of how to respond. No one had ever said something so delicate to her. She was used to hollow compliments or hurried glances. But with him, every word felt intentional, like someone writing a letter by hand. For the first time, she began to wonder, what if this was more than just friendship? Later, they sat in a small pastry shop, the kind that seemed frozen in time. They shared a slice of key lime pie and laughed at something silly, like two kids rediscovering life's lightness. Emily realized it had been a long time since she'd laughed like that, truly, without holding back. Nicholas watched her quietly, as if committing each of her expressions to memory. And between sips of tea, she noticed that she no longer felt nervous around him. The fear was giving way to something new: comfort, presence, trust. On the way home, Nicholas walked her all the way to the gate of the small townhouse she shared with Sophie. Night had fallen, and the streetlights cast soft shadows across the sidewalks. Emily thanked him for the walk, her heart still racing with emotions she couldn't quite name. Before saying goodbye, There was a pause, that kind of silence that doesn't ask for words, only courage. Nicholas held her gaze for a few seconds, and instead of kissing her, he whispered, "It was the best day I've had in a long time." Emily smiled, and when she closed the gate behind her, leaning her back against the wooden panels and closing her eyes, she felt something had been planted inside her. And this time, it was impossible to pretend it wasn't blooming. Their meetings became a kind of unspoken refuge. Nicholas always showed up with a new excuse. A book for her, a flower left on the table, or simply the unmistakable desire to see her. Emily, even without admitting it to herself, already waited for him with a restless heart. They talked about everything and nothing, laughed, shared memories, and between them, there was a connection that needed no explanation. But the deeper the bond grew, the more Nicholas found himself standing at the edge of a cliff, to tell her or not who he really was. One evening, sitting on a bench at Waterfront Park, with the ocean breeze gently brushing through Emily's hair, she asked casually, "And you, Nicholas? What do you do for a living?" He hesitated. His usually steady gaze faltered for just a second. The silence that followed felt heavier than it should have. "I work in tech. I invest in a few startups," he said, choosing his words like someone walking on shards of glass. Emily nodded, believing him. She didn't know much about that world, and he seemed so simple in his ways, there was no reason to question it. What she didn't know was that she had just heard his first lie. Small in form, but enormous in the impact it would have later. Nicholas, owner of one of the largest holding companies in the country, knew his truth could change everything. Experience had taught him that when money enters the equation, people change too. Some draw closer out of interest, others pull away out of fear. And with Emily, he couldn't risk either. Not with her. That woman was unlike anyone he'd ever known. And for the first time, he wanted to be loved for his soul, not his last name. But withholding the truth, even out of fear, is still a form of dishonesty. And without realizing it, Nicholas had begun to build a bridge on sand. The days that followed were sweet, but Nicholas carried the weight of his secret like a stone lodged between his ribs. Emily, on the other hand, gave herself to their moments with lightness. She was starting to picture him in her future, even if she didn't allow herself to dream too far. It felt like, finally, someone saw her with eyes that didn't judge, didn't demand, only admired. She spoke to him about everything. The books she read to put Sophie to sleep, the old movies she loved, the poems she wrote and hid in the back of her drawer. And Nicholas listened to it all like each word was a gift. But silently, his heart tightened under the weight of a dilemma that was becoming harder and harder to bear. On a rainy afternoon, while the city hid beneath umbrellas and honking horns, Nicholas stood in front of the mirror in the five-star hotel where he was staying. He wore simple clothes, just as he had since meeting Emily, but his eyes reflected a man torn in two. He knew he couldn't keep up the half-truth for much longer, but he also knew that if she found out from someone else, forgiveness might not come. What Nicholas didn't yet understand was that true love is born from honesty, even when it's filled with risk. And sometimes, the fear of losing love is exactly what ends up destroying it. The city was wrapped in a gentle breeze that Saturday morning when Emily decided to leave work early. It was rare for her to have a moment of freedom, and Sophie had begged to visit the downtown newsstand to find a new coloring book. With her hair tied in a loose braid and wearing the blue dress she saved for special days, Emily walked along the sidewalk with a lightness in her step, maybe even happiness. It felt strange to feel that way without a concrete reason, but she no longer resisted it. Nicholas had been filling her life with a tenderness she didn't know how to live without anymore. And because of that, she started to believe just maybe she deserved that kind of joy. While Sophie was distracted by children's comics, Emily browsed the magazine rack when a familiar name made her freeze. The cover of a business magazine displayed in bold letters, Nicholas Reed, the billionaire shaping the future of American tech. Below the title, a photo. It was him, There was no doubt. The same subtle smile, the same eyes she had come to read like pages of a book. The world spun. For a few seconds, the ground disappeared beneath her. She read the headline once, twice, 3 times, as if her mind refused to accept what her eyes had already seen. He lied. From the very beginning, he lied. The walk home was quiet. Sophie, sensing the change in her sister's expression, didn't ask questions. Emily didn't cry. Not yet. But inside, a wound was tearing open with the force of deep disappointment. It wasn't about the money. It wasn't about the title. It was about trust. About everything she had shared, believing she was opening up to someone ordinary. Someone who, like her, lived with both feet on the ground and their heart in their hands. It was about having been vulnerable with someone who had hidden his true self. And what hurt most was that, for the first time, she had believed she was safe. That night, Nicholas showed up at Rosie's just like he always did. He walked in with his hands in his pockets, his eyes scanning the room, looking for her. Emily stood waiting behind the counter. And when their eyes met, he knew instantly. Something had changed. She walked up to him, placed the magazine on the table, and said with a low, steady voice, "You could have told me." Nicholas tried to explain, stumbling over his words, his eyes glassy, guilt written all over his face. "I just wanted you to see me as an ordinary man, someone real." Emily bit her lip, swallowing the pain. "And I did see you, but you didn't let me see all of you." Nicholas left that night without asking for anything. Not forgiveness, not further explanation. He knew he had damaged something precious. And Emily, despite the hurt, couldn't bring herself to hate him. What hurt the most was knowing that the man she had truly started to fall for wasn't a lie. He was real, and that was exactly why the disappointment cut so deep. She didn't cry until she was alone. But when the silence filled the room, she broke. Not because of his wealth, but because of what he hadn't trusted her with. Because of the fear he had of being truly loved. And maybe because she realized she was afraid to love, too. 2 days had passed since that painful confrontation, and the silence between them felt like an absence that screamed. Emily tried to stay busy at work, but her mind kept slipping into memories that now felt distant and unclear. The smiles, the walks, the lingering glances, had it all been real? Or had it been part of a carefully crafted performance by someone who knew exactly how to charm? She didn't want to think that way, but the pain spoke louder. She had given her heart in small doses, believing she was safe. Now, she felt exposed, deceived, and worse, split in two by someone she still, despite it all, wanted to trust. Nicholas couldn't bear the silence any longer. He knew he needed to see her, even if it meant hearing the words he feared the most. He appeared outside the diner before opening hours, under a sky heavy with clouds, his eyes red, his expression vulnerable. When Emily saw him standing there, she felt the urge to run. But she didn't. She took a deep breath, took off her apron, and walked out to meet him. The reunion wasn't sweet. It was tense, painful, and as honest as everything they had lived through together. "Why did you lie, Nicholas? Why didn't you trust me?" she asked, her voice trembling, but steady. He lowered his gaze, unable to meet her eyes for more than a second. "Because I was afraid. Afraid of losing the only place where I was just me." Emily felt the sting of tears behind her eyes, but she didn't let them fall. "And still, you took away my right to choose. You gave me pieces of you, but you hid the rest. That hurts." Nicholas stepped closer, his voice thick with emotion. "I fell in love with you before I even realized it. I didn't want to scare you. You were the first person to see me as just a man. And that gave me courage, but it also made me a coward." Emily listened in silence. The pain he carried was real, but so was hers. "And now?" she asked. "What do we do with all of this?" Nicholas wanted to say he'd stay, that he'd wait as long as it took. But something in Emily's eyes told him she needed space. Silence. "Now, I let you breathe," he said, his voice barely holding together. Emily nodded, unable to find the strength to say anything more. Nicholas walked away slowly, as if each step was a temporary goodbye. And when he turned the corner, she allowed one tear to fall. Just one. Enough to release the weight of the pain. Because sometimes, love doesn't end with a goodbye. It simply retreats. And inside Emily, despite her wounded heart, something whispered that this wasn't the end. But it couldn't be the beginning again. Not yet. Time seemed to crawl. Since their last encounter, the days had come in muted tones, as if the color had been washed out of the world by Nicholas's absence. Emily carried on with her routine at Rosie's, serving customers with the same polite smile. But something had changed in her eyes, a quiet emptiness where lightness used to live. It wasn't anger that consumed her, nor was it raw bitterness. It was a blend of disappointment and longing, of sorrow wrapped in memory. Every corner of the diner seemed to whisper his name. The park bench, the tucked-away pastry shop, even the flower mural, everything had become a living memory. Sophie, as sensitive as ever, noticed her sister's silence. She didn't ask questions, but she hugged Emily more than usual, as if trying to fill the space Nicholas had left behind. At night, when the city slept and the house lights were off, Emily would lie awake staring at the ceiling, wondering if he thought about her too. If he still walked past the diner. If he still remembered the taste of her coffee, the sound of her laughter, the way they used to share a slice of key lime pie like it was a sacred ritual. She missed him, but more than that, she missed how she felt when she was with him, whole. Across town, Nicholas was living in the same silence, but with a different weight. His days were full of meetings, numbers, decisions, yet nothing made sense. The suit was back on his shoulders, business dinners returned to his schedule. The luxury cars were once again parked in the garage, but he wasn't really there. He was still sitting on that wooden bench in the park, listening to Emily talk about how her mother used to bake cornbread on Sundays. He was in the glow of her eyes when she spoke of Sophie. He was in the kiss that never happened, but that his heart remembered as if it had. Nicholas now understood that Emily's absence hurt more than any financial loss he had ever suffered. During this time, neither of them reached out. It was as if they were respecting each other's space, but also secretly hoping the other would make the first move. There was a kind of unspoken longing that lived in the small gestures. Emily still made coffee the way he liked it without even realizing. Nicholas still opened the map app on his phone and searched for the diner, as if seeing it marked on the screen could bring him closer to her. The love hadn't left, it had simply retreated, waiting for the pain to clear the way for clarity. It was during a quiet afternoon, as Emily washed coffee cups at the end of her shift, that she realized she still loved him. Not like someone dreaming, but like someone who accepts. She accepted that he had made a mistake, that he had lied, but also that he had been sincere in so many other ways. That the way he looked at her wasn't an act. That his presence had changed her. And in that moment, with tears welling in her eyes and soap bubbles on her hands, she understood. Maybe forgiveness doesn't come from the absence of pain, but from the strength to acknowledge that sometimes love is also built in the imperfections. And maybe, just maybe, it wasn't too late. A light rain was falling that Sunday afternoon, gently wetting the sidewalks of Charleston. Emily was returning from the market with a bag of groceries when she saw an envelope tucked beneath the diner's door, addressed to her in familiar handwriting. Her heart raced, but she didn't allow herself to hope. She opened it slowly, like someone unwrapping a memory. Inside was just one handwritten sentence. "You taught me that love is presence. I want to show you I've learned." And beneath it, an address. Place she didn't recognize. No signature, but she knew. It was him. She hesitated for a few hours, but something inside her, something gentle and persistent, urged her to grab her coat and leave. She took a cab even though money was tight. The address led her to the suburbs, to an old building with a pale facade. There was something mysterious about it, but not threatening. As she stepped out of the car, she noticed a small, newly installed sign on the gate. Maria Parker Children's Support Center. Her heart nearly stopped. Maria, her mother's name. Her hands began to tremble. She walked inside without knowing how, and her eyes were instantly overwhelmed with an emotion too big to hold in her chest. In the main room, freshly painted and filled with new toys, she found Nicholas, dressed in simple jeans, a light t-shirt, and wearing a nervous smile. "This place had been abandoned for years," he began, his voice unsteady. "I found out during our walks that your mother always dreamed of opening something like this. A safe space where children could play, learn, and dream. I couldn't get the idea out of my head. So, I started here." Emily couldn't hold back the tears. She walked toward him like someone crossing the past just to touch the present. "Why?" she whispered. "Why would you do this after everything?" He looked at her with tenderness and answered slowly, deliberately, "Because you saved me from an empty life, and all I want now is to give that back, even if it's little by little." Emily stepped forward, her fingers brushing against the freshly varnished wooden railing, breathing in the scent of new paint, hearing the distant sound of children in a reading room. It was as if the dreams that had never fit into her life were now there, alive, breathing. And he had done this for her mother, for the little girl who spent her life without anyone who believed in her dreams. Emily closed her eyes tightly, trying to hold back the tears, but she couldn't. "You didn't need to impress me, Nicholas," she murmured. "I didn't want to impress you, Emily. I just wanted to deserve you." She embraced him, not out of impulse but out of truth. A hug that was all at once forgiveness, recognition, and rebirth. They didn't say they loved each other. They didn't say everything was fixed. But in that embrace lived a world of intentions, unspoken promises, and feelings untouched by pain. And there, between freshly painted walls and the soft sound of rain falling outside, Emily knew. Sometimes, love is just that. It's when the right words don't come, but the gesture speaks for them. And that gesture on that day would change everything. That night, Emily couldn't sleep. Not from anguish, but from the intensity of everything she had just experienced. She felt like she was floating somewhere between what had been and what could still be. She replayed the hug she'd shared with Nicholas, the quiet warmth of it, the words left unspoken, yet planted like seeds deep in her chest. His gesture, so unexpected, so delicate, had cracked open the walls she had built. Here was a man who had made mistakes, yes, but who had also transformed himself in the light of the love he felt for her. And deep down, Emily knew, when love is real, forgiveness isn't weakness, it's courage. In the days that followed, Emily began visiting the center regularly. Not out of obligation, but because she wanted to. It was as if, in that place, she was rediscovering parts of herself. The children's eyes, their carefree laughter, the colorful books, everything seemed to heal her. Nicholas never forced his presence. He simply waited patiently, respectfully. Whenever she arrived, his gaze would light up, but his gestures remained subtle, as if he understood that love, now, was synonymous with care. Emily began to see him with new eyes. He was no longer the man who had disappointed her. He was the man who had chosen to start over through the hardest path, the quiet road of redemption. One afternoon, after a story time with the kids, Nicholas walked her to the gate. The sun lit up the loose strands of her hair, and her eyes looked calm. "I don't expect things to go back to how they were," he said softly. "I just want you to know I'm still here. No masks, no excuses, just here." Emily looked at him for a long moment, as if scanning his soul. And then, gently taking his hand, she replied, "Maybe what we built before really does belong in the past. Because what we're building now, is even more beautiful." Nicholas smiled, and there, in that tender touch, they formed the first bond of a new beginning. They didn't go back to being a couple overnight. There were no grand declarations or eternal vows. What they had now was deeper than haste, more truthful than idealized romance. Every conversation, every walk, every glance exchanged was another brick carefully laid into something that, this time, would be solid. Emily came to know him outside of the initial enchantment, and what she found was a human man, flawed, yes, but willing to learn, to grow, to become better. And Nicholas, in turn, fell in love with her all over again, this time with both feet on the ground and his heart wide open. On one of those days, as they strolled through the park they loved so much, Emily stopped beneath the same tree where they'd had their first real conversation. She looked up at the sky, took a deep breath, and said, "I forgive you, not just for me, but for everything we still have a chance to live." Nicholas didn't reply with words. He simply pulled her into a long, silent, necessary embrace. It was there, among dancing leaves and soft breaths, that they understood. Their love wouldn't be perfect, but it would be real. And for two hearts that had known pain, that was enough to begin again. Autumn arrived subtly in Charleston, painting the leaves in shades of gold and crimson, as if the city were dressing up for something special. Emily was leaving work when she found a white envelope on her windshield, her name written in delicate lettering. Inside, a note with just one sentence, "Tonight at 7, where it all began." Her heart immediately sped up. She knew it was Nicholas, but she had no idea what he was planning. It wasn't fear she felt, it was anticipation, the kind that grows silently inside your chest and takes over your breath. At exactly 7 o'clock, Emily arrived at Waterfront Park. The sky had already begun to surrender its final streaks of blue to the lilac of night. And there, beneath the Ravenel Bridge, where the city seemed to meet the sky, was Nicholas. He stood with his back to her, hands in his pockets, eyes fixed on the horizon. The ground around him was lit with tiny lights, like stars that had decided to descend for just one night. When he saw her, he smiled, not a wide grin, but that quiet, half-smile that only appears when the soul is at peace. "Remember when I told you that you saved me from an empty life?" he began, his voice soft. "That day, I didn't realize just how true it was, but now I know for sure." Emily stepped forward slowly, her legs trembling. Nicholas gently took her hands in his. "I didn't prepare a speech. I just want to say what I feel." He took a deep breath. "I found in you what money could never give me. Purpose, truth, love, and I want to spend the rest of my life loving you the way you deserve. To be loved with respect, with calm, and with wholeness." Then he knelt. There were no photographers, no flashes, no extravagant rings. Just a small velvet box with a simple, delicate band. The kind Emily had always dreamed of, and somehow, he had known without her ever needing to say it. "Emily Parker, will you marry me?" The world stopped. The distant noise of the city seemed to vanish. All that remained was the sound of her heart pounding in her chest. Emily brought a hand to her mouth, her eyes full of tears, and for a few seconds, she couldn't speak. She just looked at him, as if she were watching an entire lifetime flash before her in a single moment. Then she knelt too, and through tears and smiles, she answered in a trembling voice, "I say yes, because you love me with your soul, because you chose me when I only knew how to survive, because I want to choose you too." Every day, they embraced right there, on their knees, surrounded by lights and silence, sealing the most intimate and genuine moment of their lives. There was no audience, no applause, but there was everything, because sometimes the most powerful kind of love lives in the subtlest of gestures. And that night, beneath the stars borrowed from the ground, two hearts that had once been lost found each other, never to lose one another again. The wedding took place months later, on a warm spring afternoon. in the same garden where Nicholas had reopened the children's center. No grand cathedral, no endless guest list. Emily wanted something intimate, full of meaning, where every flower had been chosen with care and every gaze present carried real love. Sophie was the flower girl, her hair tied in tiny braids and a proud smile lighting up her face. When Emily entered, dressed simply, eyes glowing, Nicholas nearly forgot how to breathe. Not because of the dress, but because of the woman walking toward him. The woman he would choose every single day of his life. They exchanged vows beneath a centuries-old tree, its leaves whispering blessings, and the blue sky bearing witness. They didn't promise perfection. They promised patience, tenderness, space, and presence. Nicholas vowed never to let distance grow between them again, and Emily promised to keep alive the woman she was before it all, the one who smiled even on hard days. When they kissed, it wasn't just a celebration of marriage. It was the confirmation that two separate stories could become one without losing their essence. A love like that doesn't erase the past. It embraces it, transforms it, and makes it part of the present. Life as a couple began without grand gestures, but with a routine built on the details that truly mattered. Emily chose to keep working at Rosie's at least once a week, so she'd never forget where she came from. Nicholas supported her without question. That's where she felt most alive. On Sundays, they visited the center with Sophie, who now dreamed of becoming a teacher. Together, they decorated a house full of windows, where sunlight entered freely and silence felt comforting. They laughed more than they argued. They were partners in every sense. And even on ordinary days, Emily felt she had married someone who didn't just love her. He saw her completely. Nicholas had changed, too. He no longer needed meetings in cold boardrooms to feel important. He began dedicating part of his investments to social projects, each one named after someone who had left a mark on his journey. But what mattered most was the way he looked at Emily, with reverence, gratitude, and a tenderness that didn't fade over time. He knew now that his greatest fortune wasn't in numbers, but in the woman who had pulled him from emptiness with the simple gesture of serving him a cup of coffee with 2 spoons of sugar and an honest smile. The waitress who became everything. The woman who became home. One late afternoon, as they watched Sophie playing in the backyard with other children, Emily held Nicholas's hand and whispered, "If someone had told me my life would change on that exhausting shift, I would have laughed." He smiled, resting his forehead against hers. "I never expected to find love in that diner." She smiled back. "Neither did I expect that the stranger who walked in would be the love of my life." And so, in simplicity and surrender, 2 worlds became one, not through wealth, but through the daily choice to love with truth, patience, and gratitude. If you enjoyed this video, let us know in the comments. Your opinion is very important to us. Don't forget to subscribe. A big hug, and see you in the next video.